The Nile River was the life force of ancient Egypt, creating the fertile corridor that allowed one of history's most sophisticated Bronze Age civilizations to thrive. But the Nile was never static. Since the African humid period, its channels, tributaries, and branches have shifted dramatically across the landscape, reshaping how ancient Egyptians lived and built their world. Understanding these changes is crucial for reconstructing life in both dynastic Egypt and the later Ptolemaic era. A new study focusing on the Qana Bend uses remote sensing technology to uncover how the Nile once interacted with the Dendera temple complex and reveals a very different ancient environment from the one we see today. In this video, I explore the findings of this new research and revisit earlier studies showing how closely many of Egypt's pyramids were connected to ancient waterways. The African humid period began around 15,000 years ago during the terminal Pleistocene and lasted for roughly 10 millennia. During this wetter climatic phase, the Sahara was far more habitable than it is today, while the Nile Valley itself was often difficult to live in due to high river levels, extensive marshlands, and powerful flooding events. Around 5,000 years ago, rainfall across the region declined significantly, triggering a gradual drying of North Africa. As sediment accumulated within the Nile's channels, the floodplain and surrounding wetlands began to contract, creating a more stable and predictable landscape that was better suited for agriculture and permanent settlement. This coincided with the start of the Old Kingdom, but although the climate was drier than it had been, it was still quite different to how it is there today. Because Egypt's arid climate and thousands of years of human activity have heavily altered the landscape, reconstructing ancient waterways in the field is extremely challenging. To overcome this, the researchers of the paper I'm discussing today relied primarily on remote sensing techniques, later validating their findings through soil coring and detailed topographic surveys. The study focused on the Qana Bend of the Nile, around 60 kilometers north of Luxor. Just south of this curve lies the vast temple complex of Dendera, a sacred site made up of multiple structures and a ceremonial lake. Its most famous monument is the Temple of Hathor, which was home to the renowned Dendera zodiac, now on display at the Louvre. The entire complex is enclosed by a massive mud brick wall. Although the oldest surviving sections date to around 360 BCE, during the reign of Egypt's last native pharaoh, Nectanebo II, most of the site was built during the Greco-Roman period. However, archaeological evidence suggests that earlier temples and shrines existed here as far back as the Old Kingdom. North of the Temple of Hathor, a processional causeway leads to an ancient quay that today stands isolated from any major body of water. However, evidence from the new studies suggests that a now lost branch of the Nile once flowed directly alongside this quay while the temple complex was still active. If this reconstruction is accurate, the Dendera temple complex would have been directly accessible by boat, with this water channel likely serving as a major transport route for both construction materials and labourers working at the site. It's important to note, however, that the channel shown here is an interpretation based on remote sensing and landscape data. While the evidence strongly suggests a former Nile branch existed in this area, its precise course and full extent have not yet been conclusively confirmed. Researchers also digitized towns and villages from historical maps produced in 1911 and overlaid them onto reconstructed islands and paleo channels of the ancient river system. The results reveal a remarkable pattern. Many settlements were positioned beside channels of the Nile that have since disappeared from the modern landscape. The Dendera temple area was also home to a necropolis that remained in use from the early dynastic period through to the first intermediate period. This suggests that the former Nile channel may have shaped how the site was accessed, supplied, and ritually used for many centuries. Dendera is not the only place where a lost branch of the Nile appears to have influenced the construction of monumental architecture. Today, the Giza pyramids stand around 7 kilometers west of the modern Nile. These monuments were never intended to exist in isolation. Each pyramid formed part of an extensive funerary complex that included mortuary temples, processional causeways, valley temples, subsidiary pyramids, and ceremonial enclosures. It's now widely accepted that the valley temples once stood beside navigable water, while the workers' settlement of Hayt el-Ghurab likely functioned as a port town connected to the Nile system. Archaeological discoveries and geomorphological evidence strongly support this interpretation, as does the Wadi el-Jaf papyri discovered at a Khufu age port on the Red Sea. In this text, a harbour complex is referred to as entrance to the lake or basin of Khufu. Over the years, researchers have used increasingly sophisticated techniques to test this idea, leading to the proposal of a now lost Nile channel, often called the Khufu branch. This ancient waterway is thought to have flowed close to the valley temples, the town of Kaniewski, and the workers' settlement of Hayt el-Ghurab, forming a vital transport corridor during the construction of the Giza pyramid complexes. One particularly interesting reconstruction of this landscape appears on the Ancient Egypt Research Associates website, which also documents the archaeological excavations at Giza in an accessible way. If you want to explore the sites further, I fully recommend taking a look at this website, which I've linked in the description below. More recently, another study expanded on this idea by examining the narrow strip of desert where Egypt's greatest concentration of pyramids was built. Along the west bank of the Nile, between Lisht in the south and Giza in the north, stands a chain of 31 pyramids constructed between the Old Kingdom and the Second Intermediate Period. These include the pyramid fields of Lisht, Dashur, Saqqara, Abu Sir, and of course Giza itself. If these massive pyramid complexes require huge quantities of stone, supplies, and labour, how were they reached? Since the Nile lies several kilometers to the east, separated from the pyramid fields by desert, the study proposed that in antiquity, a major branch of the Nile once flowed much closer to these sites, providing the waterways needed to transport construction materials and workers directly to the pyramid complexes. A paper published in 2024 set out to investigate whether traces of a lost branch of the Nile could still be detected near these pyramid fields. Using synthetic aperture radar imagery, high-resolution elevation data, and geophysical surveys, the researchers identified the remains of an ancient channel running alongside the pyramids, which they named the Aramat branch. According to the study, this was no minor stream. The branch is thought to have measured between 200 and 700 meters wide, between 2 and 8 meters deep, and to have stretched for around 64 kilometers along the edge of the desert plateau. At Giza, as I said before, the valley temples are believed to have formed part of a harbour complex connected to this waterway. These harbours would have played a crucial role not only in transporting stone and supplies during the construction of the pyramids, but also in carrying people and offerings during royal funerary processions. Today, only 2 of Giza's valley temples still survive, those associated with the pyramids of Khafra and Menkaure. Researchers believe that many of the pyramid complexes further south once had similar harbour temples, although not all have survived. Among the surviving examples are the Valley Temple of Sahara at Abu Sir and that of Pepi II at Saqqara. What's particularly striking is that these surviving valley temples all sit along the reconstructed course of the Aramat branch, strongly suggesting that this ancient channel was still an active and navigable waterway during the Old Kingdom when many of these pyramids were built. The researchers also identified several buried inlets branching off from the Aramat branch. One of the most significant is the Dashur inlet, which appears to have extended all the way to the valley temple of the Bent Pyramid, connected to the pyramid itself by a 700-meter causeway. Interestingly, this extinct channel was still visible on historical maps, where it was labelled as Wadi al-Tafla. The Dashur inlet may also have provided access to several nearby pyramids, including the Old Kingdom Red Pyramid, as well as the Black Pyramid, the White Pyramid, and the Pyramid of Senusret II, which date to the Middle Kingdom and lie about a kilometre east of the earlier monuments. This suggests that the course of the Aramat branch gradually shifted eastwards over time. Further north, another extinct channel known as the Sahara Inlet appears to have connected the pyramids of Pepi II and Marriner to the river system. Meanwhile, at Giza, researchers identified what they describe as a lagoon-like river arm, the Giza Inlet, which extended directly towards the valley temples at the foot of the plateau. In this reconstruction, we can see how the Aramat branch and the Giza Inlet may have worked together to serve the Giza Harbour complex. This closely matches the conclusions of the earlier study that proposed the so-called Khufu branch, with both studies pointing towards an extensive network of waterways linking the pyramid complexes to the Nile. Today, many of Egypt's temples and pyramids stand isolated beside the desert, far from the modern Nile. But these monuments were not built in a dry and empty landscape. They were connected to a dynamic network of waterways that carried stone, workers, and funerary processions across ancient Egypt. Studies like these are transforming how we understand the Nile Valley, revealing that beneath the fields and the sands of modern-day Egypt lies the buried outline of a very different world, one where the river flowed beside the pyramids themselves. And with every new survey, more of that lost landscape is beginning to re-emerge. What do you think about the new study into the Kaina Bend next to the Dendera temple complex? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.